Hi, this is Paul. In my conversation with Mark Lefevre, I made mention of this section of the question and answer video. Now, he's answering a question about Jung and his critique of Jung because he often critiques other people. And the questioner asked, what would his critique of Jung be? But what was interesting to me about this answer was that he gave a little bit of some insight from his clinical practice about the kinds of people and how they, well, he didn't frame it this way, but for me, the framing was how people process and how people process. It's really difficult. Immediately when he said it, I recognized it as a pastor, because in my conversation with John Vervaeke side of things, the awakening from the meaning crisis, religion that isn't a religion, one of my critiques of that is, which I said in my conversation with Mark, there's no end to the complexity in humanity, and it is just like it is very difficult to write a fairy tale. It's very difficult to construct a religion, because the breadth of human diversity is enormous, and about the only way to actually construct a religion is through time. Now, if you go back to my conversation with Byrne, we talked a lot about time. My conversation with Byrne Powers, we talked a lot about time, because it's in time that all of these things unfold. And, Peugeot has had some very interesting statements about time and space. Byrne was riffing on time. And so when it comes to creating institutions, events, relationships that afford human flourishing, there's almost no substitute for time. So let's take a listen to this.
You discuss almost any thinker's flaws in their thinking except for Jung's. What were his? Well, I think Jung overgeneralized his experiences, his clinical experiences. He conceptualized the hero's journey as something that was fundamentally creative and interior. And I think that that's probably true only for people who are really high in trait openness, who are creative. And I suspect that Jung attracted a tremendously disproportionate number of creative people to his practice, given the nature of his personality and his interests.
See, when I started this, I knew nothing about Jung, very little about Jung. I'd probably heard his name referenced in a college psychology class. What I did know was that Jung has a near cult following, and some of you are part of that. And I saw interest in Carl Jung look in some ways very religious. But many would say, no, it's not really a religion. And, I as much as possible, I try to take people at their word. But what he said right here really connected with me, because people who are temperamentally, culturally, but especially temperamentally given to, and by virtue of their formation, of how they've been raised, given to predominantly relate to the world in this sort of way. You find that in church. You find people, because churches tend to have broad communities of people, and so your temperament, the spectrum over the big five, which is Peterson scale, will be diverse in church. Now, that doesn't mean that churches and denominations don't themselves elicit patterns. There are certain kinds of people that tend to go Pentecostal, certain kinds of people that tend to go Roman Catholic, certain kinds of people that tend to be frozen chosen Dutch Calvinists. So there's a lot of that going on. But what religions do and what religious institutions do, and this is why it's very difficult to create a a religion that's not a religion is because, and John Vervaeke and I have talked about this. Not only do you have questions of scale, it's got to scale in terms of there needs to be something for the adult with Down syndrome, and for adults with low IQ, and for adults who are high in agreeableness, and for adults who are low in agreeableness, and for children, and for different cultures. And so it's got to scale, and that scaling has to be coherent enough to hang together, but still offer enough to encourage and support the people along the way. And part of what has happened in the cult of intentionality, which in modernity really has risen, is that we're not as smart as we think we are. And so this, in some ways, affords an advantage to conservatives, because at least conservatives acknowledge that they don't know enough or that much. So having heard that, let's go back and re-listen to this. And then he goes through a few other different types of people. And it was interesting that because he has been thinking about religion in the abstract, not practicing it, but religion in the abstract for such a long time, he began to notice these patterns in his clients.
To his interior journey experiences, he conceptualized the hero's journey as something that was fundamentally creative and interior.
That's really key. Creative and interior. And certain kinds of people, probably some of you who listen to YouTube and podcasts, creative and interior. But we're sitting in our houses all the time, especially during COVID.
And I think that that's probably true only for people who are really high in trait openness, who are creative. And I suspect that Jung attracted a tremendously disproportionate number of creative people to his practice, given the nature of his personality and his interests.
And then his following afterwards.
I've found in my own practice that when I had creative people, they were very inclined towards the discussion of literary themes. They framed their life in literary terms. They were prolific dreamers, very interested in dream analysis. They enjoyed a literary approach to life.
And so whatever you have in your institution, in your practices, in your events, in your tradition that connects with those kinds of people, they will tend to gravitate that. But in terms of a whole community, because you do want something that will be in the whole community, you're going to need things for the other kinds of people too.
My more conservative clients, often equally high performing, although I had a practice that spanned the entire range of human ability, they weren't interested or captivated by that at all. And for them, the primary adventure of life wasn't internal or literary. It was external and practical.
And you find this in churches all the time. Maybe you need a building project or something to be done. Well, it's the business people that step up. That gets them excited. The pastor is going on with a story or something like that, and their eyes roll over. And there's probably some connection between conservatism and a focus on that which has been built and that which works, because generally speaking, that which works survives. And so it's interesting that you sort of have the high in openness, who are the literary, the idealists. They're very immaterial, and then you have the conservatives. They're much more concrete, much more material, and of course, everything that has been instantiated in material is in a sense already in the past. Where for the visionaries and the high in openness people who are literary and narrative in nature, well, their orientation is to the future.
And the more agreeable types, their life was primarily social rather than symbolic or creative. They found most of the meaning in their life as a consequence of the intimate relationships that they were able to establish. It wasn't in...
So in church, you see people who, pastor can preach whatever he wants, and maybe every now and then he'll say something that they'll say, oh yeah, that's right. But they're there for the people. They're there for... The main event for them is the coffee and, sometimes bad coffee and bad treats after the service, or the potluck, or the texting in the middle of the week, the the community that the church has created and developed and facilitates and flourishes, that's the church for them. So in other words, for the high and openness people, it's all these ideas and the literary and the story. That's why they go to church. And then for the conservatives, it's the getting things done and doing things and instantiating things in materiality. That's why they're, and of course, all of these are huge generalizations. And then for the social, it's the people and it's the community and we're a family. And you just see these layers and layers and layers in a real life church.
Frequent, and this was more true of women than of men. And
you cannot kill women's Bible studies once they get going. It's more true of women than of men.
Higher in agreeableness on average. I had conscientious clients who would frame their life in terms of their accomplishments, their career accomplishments. That's how they parsed their life up temporally. First, I was in school, and then I went to university, and
you can hear this at funerals.
Studied this, and then it was all achievement oriented. Whereas the more agreeable types, they would say, well, when I was 12 years old to 14, I had this relationship, and then I moved to this relationship, usually the intimate relationship, so sometimes familial, framed their life that way. Jung was introverted and highly, highly open. And so that skewed his view in a particular way. And then because he was psychoanalytic, he also tended to view the psyche as sane as a consequence of its internal organization and even its internal ethic, and placed much less stress on the role of social interactions and society as a whole in producing sanity. A sane person is not only organized internally, but they're integrated with their society. And the internal organization actually reflects the social organization. They mirror one another.
And this is, and again, conservatives tend to, what has happened in our culture is that you have, my intent here is not to make a political statement, but the larger government goes and the fewer mid-level institutions you have, I don't mean just implicit institutions like marriage, but formal institutions and instantiated institutions like churches and clubs and groups. These mid-level institutions are fundamental for working out all of these things together.
And although Jung, being a very sophisticated person, of course, knew that social adaptation was necessary, it was more his colleague Alfred Adler, who was more politically on the left, by the way, as well, who concentrated more on the interpersonal aspects of life and the role of socialization in the maintenance of, and the maintenance of intimate relationships, say.
Back to my conversation, I should probably talk to Sevilla again. My conversation with Sevilla a while ago now, where she was, first she was an art, she went to art school, and then eventually she got into therapy. And she began to notice the function that religious institutions were playing in struggling communities, I'll say it that way, instead of all the other usual ways that we talk about communities where there's less affluence, educational underperformance, more crime, and noted the fundamental roles of religious communities in those spaces. Well, why? Well, because what's happening in those churches, in those mid-level institutions, is they are trying to stay sane. They are trying to process the near infinite complexity of human community and life in this world to achieve thriving. And so what happens if you lose those communities, you're going to have real trouble. Now, I made an observation yesterday, and I put it out on Twitter. One of the things that continues to... There's something about Jordan as a person which has caught my attention, and I don't know him personally, so Anything I say here is completely from a distance, and maybe I shouldn't say it at all, but why stop now? He almost never recommends in these question and answer sessions that people seek a therapist. Now, I noted in his conversation with the guy who left the Grace Church School in New York City that he commented that, well, someone with a good therapist. But, and I actually had some back and forth on Twitter with some of you about that. I don't know that he has a great deal of confidence in his profession. And I think that same hesitancy is probably also expressed in his reluctance to commit himself to a in real life, living, breathing religious community. And that's not unusual for Jordan Peterson. And it's part temperamental. There's a lot of things that go into it, some good, some not so good. But I think that's part of why he isn't in church. I don't think that he trusts churches, just like I don't think he trusts other therapists. He trusts therapy, but there's a certain, I hate to leave him sitting here with his arm in the air. There we go. Okay. In a way, and this has been marked in a lot of what he does it himself. He trusts his family. He trusts his wife and his kids and a small circle of friends. It's probably kind of introverted. But I don't hear him refer and say, go find a therapist. And on Twitter, somebody pushed back and said, yeah, have you seen what's out there in terms of therapy? And given everything that he said, I can understand the systemic skepticism about the helpfulness of therapists out there. And I dealt with this in a question and answer a few weeks ago. I've got actually a lot of thoughts about how therapy is constituted in terms of the degree to which it aligns with Christianity. And I'm not saying, don't understand me in a black and white way here. But I regularly, I will advise people to, if I think they have a need, that maybe a good therapist might help them. But I have also seen many situations in which, in my opinion, someone's interaction and commitment to a therapist has made them worse. I also recommend that people find a church and start going to it, whereas I also am fully aware that, sort of like perhaps Jordan Peterson is to other therapists, I could very well be the same with respect to other pastors and churches. And when I say go find a church, in some ways I'm a bit horrified at what's going on in all those churches. But at the same time, there is, and this is really interesting with respect to Jordan, because Jordan likes to continue to make the point of approaching the world. How does he say it? Not assuming that, basically not assuming that being is evil. Approach the world with a, for lack of a better word, with positive anticipation that truth-telling and truthful, honest, earnest engagement with the world will produce good things. And so in that sense, I wonder if he distrusts therapists more than he trusts the world. And again, given everything that he said about who's going into therapy and his political stance and all of that, I can very much understand that. But he doesn't seem to have a lot of confidence in his guild. And that's interesting. Maybe it's because Jung has not been, has not found favor with many in the therapeutic world. But I wonder if in many ways that same posture, which I'm sure is part temperament and lots of other things that go to it, is part of what keeps him away from church. And I've known many people like that with respect to church. Now, trust issues is too broad, but in a sense, you have to really lean into and practice that positive anticipation, that approach to the world in all the ways that he likes to talk about it, will in fact bring positive reactions. So this is, I don't know how long this video is, but just a little video. It's going to force me to post my conversation with Mark a little bit early, which is fine. But I wanted to get this. I guess I could actually post this now. I don't know. I'll have to figure out what order I post them in. But I just wanted to find that clip and play it, because as a pastor, when I listened to that clip, I thought, yeah, and that actually has a lot to do with Vervaeke's religion that isn't a religion, and the possibility of creating an ecology of practices that afford self-transcendence, and on and on. So thanks for watching.